Every plate you add to this belt widens a gap. On one side, your pecs and your lats. On the other, the muscles that are actually supposed to be holding your shoulder together. And that gap might eventually be what stops you, not the weight. I'd hit the best numbers that I would ever hit, and then the front of my shoulder would inevitably flare up, and I'd be set back weeks, if not months. I thought the shoulder was my problem, but it wasn't. Weighted pull-ups and dips are the two best upper body exercises in calisthenics, and I'm not about to tell you to stop doing them. I do them pretty much every week, but every plate that you add to that belt widens a gap, and that gap is actually what took those months off me. I'm a sports chiropractor, and I get to see the finished result of this walk into my clinic every week. And I've had it myself plenty of times on my way to hitting over 150% of my body weight in additional weight on my way to dip. So I'm going to show you what that gap is, why these two exercises that are some of my favorites unfortunately build it, and the 3 things you can do to close it. You'll keep every bit of your strength and more, and you'll stop paying for it with your shoulders. First, let's be clear about why these two are worth building your training around, because that's exactly why the problem sneaks up on you. Progression is reliable. You add weight, you know it went up, and you know by how much. That sounds obvious until you try to track progress on something like a muscle up. These weighted calisthenics movements are also super stable by calisthenics standards. There's no big balance element eating at your output, so you can reliably push them close to muscular failure set after set and week after week if you want, which guarantees reliable, consistent muscle growth. And form is easy to standardize. A pull-up is straight elbows in a hang to chin over the bar. A dip, as long as you're getting your shoulder and the back of that rear delt to your elbow or lower. Between these, your reps today are pretty much always going to be the same as your reps last month. Put those 3 together and they become something more useful than exercises. They become your measuring tools. Compare that to muscle ups, handstand push-ups, or bodyweight skill variations where balance, a couple of kilos of extra body weight one week, or a small form change that you don't even realize you're making can make the same movement feel completely different from one set to the next, and where jumps between progressions can be enormous. Beyond that, pull-ups and chin-ups train every pulling muscle that you've got to some degree. The raw lat and elbow flexor mass that you build with them in the biceps and brachioradialis is the staple driver behind everything else that you want to pull. Muscle ups, one-arm pull-ups, front levers, none of these happen without a reliable driver of that growth behind them. And dips give you some serious chest and tricep strength and control. If you can move heavy weight on a dip, your other presses stay solid. Weighted bench, pseudo planche push-ups, one-arm push-ups, they all ride on this same base. So these are 2 genuinely elite exercises. And everything I'm about to say assumes that you want to keep doing them. Here's the catch. For all the transferable strength they build, both of these lean incredibly hard on a few of your biggest prime movers. Your pecs and your lats are doing most of the driving in both of these. Over months and years of loading that, the gap between these big prime movers and those smaller stabilizer muscles of the shoulders and the shoulder blades starts to widen. Not because the small ones are getting weaker, but those big ones just keep getting so much stronger, and then there just isn't the same stimulus to pull those small ones along with them. And both of your prime movers here are what we call internal rotators. So as they get more dominant, they start pulling your shoulders forwards and closing your posture down. That's the part I see in clinic constantly. Upper back tightness, neck pain, and that visual side of it too, with those slumped shoulders and rounded back postures that people will spend a fortune trying to fix, which for the athletic clients that I treat so often comes from those persistent lifting imbalances they've spent years building without realizing. It goes deeper than posture too. When you keep progressing load and those stabilizers haven't kept up, they start losing the ability to do their actual job, which is keeping the ball of the shoulder centered in the socket and keeping the shoulder blade properly secured to your ribcage while it moves. Think about it like this. Your muscles are the engine. Your joints, your bones, your tendons, and the stabilizers holding them in position are the structure that engine's attached to and drives. If you just keep adding more and more power thoughtlessly to that engine without making sure that structure's keeping up and can handle all that extra torque, not only does the structure start having power directing that engine's force, but that engine can start tearing that structure apart. So instead of all that force transferring cleanly through your arms and into the bar through that stable joint system, those joints can't hold their position and instead start leaking that power in all other directions. That's when the list starts. Bicep and rotator cuff tendons, shoulder impingement, tennis and golfer's elbow, even things like labral tears and costochondritis in the chest and sternum. And the cruel part is it happens while you're still getting stronger. So every signal you're reading says that the training is working right up until this starts to stop you. That was my exact pattern for a good couple of years. I'd peak, everything would feel unstoppable, and then the front of my shoulder would go on something like a dip, or an elbow would get strained on a heavy pull-up, and I'd have to dial back that intensity for weeks trying to bring myself back up again. I kept trying to treat the front of the shoulder or the elbow where the pain was, because that's where it hurt, but that was never really the problem. It was just everything else around it that was failing to support it. And I want to be really clear that this isn't only an injury conversation, because that's how it usually gets framed, and that framing lets people ignore it if they're not in pain right now. Once those big muscles get dominant, they start pulling you in directions that you don't want to go. If your pec or lat can't relax and lengthen properly when you need it to, you will actually lose strength and you'll lose range in those directions that you want to go if you've got to fight yourself at the same time. Overhead pressing type movements are one of the most obvious ones. So you could be adding kilos to your dip every single month and be getting worse at other pressing movements at the same time without even realizing it. So which of these big muscles have become super dominant and which of these smaller vital stabilizers have started to fall behind can actually differ dramatically from person to person. It's not the same picture on everyone, and it's something that I've spent years deep diving on for my patients in my clinic as a sports chiropractor. And that's also the reason that I built in a specific stability and mobility test system into my online community so that people can actually test exactly where their structural and functional capacity is starting to break down and catch these issues before they even happen. When someone comes to me telling me their progress is stalled, this is always one of the first things I get them to do, because so often the answer just jumps out at you once we actually start testing for it. But there are usual suspects, and they're consistent enough to train blind. The scapular stabilizers, mid, lower traps, rhomboids, and rear delts. These are the ones that get left behind. And here's the thing that surprises people. Even the ones who've already been doing horizontal pulling movements are usually still missing them because they're doing the movement without the part of it that actually matters. Fix number one, wide row variations, elbows flared out rather than tucked in, which takes the lats out of it and puts those upper back muscles first. But the width isn't really the whole point. The point is that the movement has to be driven by those shoulder blades, not by your arms. Every single rep starts by letting the scapulae glide all the way forwards into a full stretch, almost off the rib cage. Then you initiate the pull by pulling them back so that your mid and lower traps and rhomboids switch on instantly before your arms have even done anything. You hold that retraction the whole way in, focusing on pinching those blades together at the top, and you only let them release again once you're all the way back at the bottom. That's it. It's the same movement so many people are doing, but if you actually get this component of it right, it'll hit those missing muscles that so often get neglected. And this applies to calisthenics rows and weighted rows equally, plus the other two that I'll always have in the mix, face pulls and halo pulls, which you can do with rings or a cable machine. All of them build capacity in the back muscles that aren't your lats, which is exactly the group that your pull-ups aren't really touching. Fix number two, and this one's for the ball and socket joint itself. The best way to keep those little stabilizers in that rotator cuff strong and capable is to put them in positions where the lats and pecs can't help drive most of that movement. Wide overhead pressing is amazing for this, and you don't need much weight at all. That's not what the exercise is really about. It's about your ability to let go with the pecs and the lats and still produce force while your rotator cuff does its job in a much less stable position without that usual heavy support underneath it. Your delts and triceps are the prime movers here, but putting your shoulders deep into external rotation and forcing those scaps back is what teaches you to be strong and comfortable in that upright, open-chested position, which is exactly the position that heavy pull-ups and dips close off completely. And if you want the calisthenics version, wide pike push-ups on rings go hard. Same job, no weight needed, and the rings really make you earn that stability. If you can perform that press with the barbell behind your neck as well, preferably seated to take the lower body out of it, you'll be working on pure upper body and shoulder stability in some of the most challenging positions, working for depth and forcing those stabilizer muscles to actually control the movement while you drive with more and more force as you get better over time. You can do the same thing, but for those pull muscles with behind the neck pull-ups as well, aiming for pauses at the top so that you train your shoulder blades and rotator cuff muscles how to stabilize alongside those bigger pull muscles. You don't even need to be strong enough to do a whole pull-up for these. You can start doing them as soon as you want by placing a bench behind you and using some assistance from your feet at the same time. If you've been loading up those dips and pull-ups for all these years, none of this is a punishment. You just want to start closing that gap that's probably already there, and the good thing is starting now means that can close quite quick. It's easier to catch up weaker muscles than it is to keep progressing with those stronger muscles, especially when those those strong ones are probably actually starting to get limited in their capacity by those lagging stabilizers. And if you're earlier in your training, you've got the better deal. You're not closing a gap, you're just never letting it even open. The same handful of movements, a fraction of the time, and you can skip the couple of years I spent working it out the hard way and trying to catch up later. None of these are the main event. They're not meant to be. They work by sitting around your heavy work. They don't really replace anything, and they don't actually need much volume to do their job. It just has to be the right work done in a specific way consistently over time. This is the stuff that generic programs often just end up leaving out entirely, and it's always the same reason why. Over 3/4 of the best research we now have in sports science and in physiotherapy and physical therapy literature has come out only really in the last 10 to 15 years, and that sudden surge in research and quality data has meant that the gap between practice and where the actual research is at has gotten wider than ever. And unfortunately in the fitness world, when most of what's out there is getting put out there by people who just simply lack the qualification or the interest to actually interpret this data properly, it's not really hard to imagine why there's so many programs out there that might look good in the short term and then fall off hard. So keep the weighted pull-ups, keep the dips. They're still the two best things that you can do for upper body strength in my opinion, and the two best ways that you can measure it with your calisthenics training. Just stop letting them be the only thing that you base your progress on. Fit in some pulls targeted for those shoulder blades. Open that chest up and practice some pressing where those big muscles can't help you. And if you want to know which of these is your weak link instead of guessing at it, I've pulled some of the upper limb half of my assessment out and made it free. It takes about 5 minutes, you can score yourself at home, and it tells you exactly where on that gap and which of these 3 that you should be doing first. Links down in the description. Build the engine and that structure together, and the gap never gets to decide when you stop.